Captain Sarah Chen had heard the whispers since the day she arrived at Forward Operating Base Rattlesnake in eastern Afghanistan. The soldiers didn't say it to her face at first. They didn't have to. She could see it in their eyes every time she walked past the motor pool or entered the mess hall. She was just a nurse, just a woman with a medical bag, just someone who would hide behind the real soldiers when things got bad. She had been in the Army for 8 years. She had served 2 previous deployments. She had pulled shrapnel from a sergeant's chest in the back of a moving Humvee, while bullets tore through the armor plating. She had earned her combat medical badge the hard way, but none of that mattered to the men of Alpha Company. To them, she was dead weight. Sergeant First Class Mike Hendricks made sure everyone knew how he felt. He was a thick-shouldered man from Alabama, with 15 years in the infantry and a chest full of ribbons. He had survived Fallujah. He had been blown up twice by roadside bombs and walked away both times, and he made it very clear that he didn't trust anyone who hadn't been through what he had been through. "We're rolling into hostile territory with a nurse," he said one evening in the operations tent, loud enough for Sarah to hear through the canvas wall. "A nurse, not even a real medic. She's gonna freeze the second we take contact." Laughter followed, deep, knowing laughter from men who believed they had seen it all. Sarah tightened her jaw and kept inventory of her medical supplies. Bandages, tourniquets, chest seals, morphine. She checked each item twice. She didn't have time for their doubts. She had a job to do. The mission briefing came 3 days later. Captain Ramirez stood at the front of the tent with a map of the region spread across a folding table. The mission was simple on paper. A convoy of 4 vehicles would travel 30 miles north to deliver supplies to a smaller outpost near the Pakistani border. The route had been quiet for 2 weeks. Intelligence reported low enemy activity. It should have been routine, but nothing in Afghanistan was ever really routine. "Chen," Captain Ramirez said, looking directly at her, "you'll ride in the 3rd vehicle. If we take casualties, you'll be our primary medical response." She nodded. "Understood, sir." Hendricks leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "With all due respect, sir, shouldn't we have someone with more combat experience in the convoy? Someone who's been outside the wire more than a few times?" Ramirez's expression didn't change. "Captain Chen has been outside the wire plenty. She's the most qualified medical officer we have. She goes." Hendricks said nothing, but his eyes told Sarah everything. He didn't believe in her. None of them did. That night, Sarah lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling of the plywood hooch she shared with 2 other female soldiers. One was a helicopter mechanic. The other was an intelligence analyst. Both of them were asleep, their breathing slow and steady. Sarah couldn't sleep. She never could the night before a mission. She thought about her father. He had been a Marine. He had told her once that respect wasn't given in the military. It was earned. And it was earned in the worst moments when everything was falling apart and people needed you most. She whispered to herself in the dark. "I'm ready." The convoy rolled out at dawn. 4 armored Humvees kicking up dust on a narrow dirt road that wound through valleys and rocky hills. The landscape was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. Mountains rose in the distance like the spine of some ancient beast. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue. Sarah sat in the back of the 3rd vehicle with her medical bag between her feet. Across from her was Private First Class Danny Moore, a 19-year-old kid from Ohio with red hair and freckles. He was nervous. She could tell by the way he kept adjusting his helmet and checking his rifle. "First time?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. You'll be fine. Just stay alert. Listen to your team leader." He looked at her with wide eyes. "Are you scared?" She smiled softly. "Every time. But that's what keeps you sharp." In the front seat, Hendricks rode shotgun. He hadn't said a word to her since they left the base. He didn't look at her. Didn't acknowledge her. To him, she was invisible. Just a nurse taking up space. The convoy moved deeper into the valley. The road narrowed. On one side was a steep rock wall. On the other was a drop-off that fell 100 feet into a dry riverbed. The perfect place for an ambush. Sarah felt it before it happened. A tightness in her chest. A shift in the air. Then the world exploded. The lead vehicle erupted in a ball of flame and smoke. The blast was so loud it felt like a physical blow. The shockwave rattled Sarah's teeth. The Humvee she was in swerved hard to the left, the driver fighting to keep control. "IED! IED!" someone screamed over the radio. Then the gunfire started. It came from the rocks above them, sharp cracking sounds that echoed through the valley. Bullets pinged off the armored hull like hail on a tin roof. The convoy was trapped. And Sarah's worst day was just beginning. The gunfire was everywhere. It came in waves, relentless and precise. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She pressed herself against the armored wall of the Humvee and forced her breathing to slow. Panic killed soldiers faster than bullets. She had learned that in her first deployment. "Get us out of here." Hendricks roared at the driver. The driver, a specialist named Torres, was already trying. He threw the vehicle in reverse, but the lead Humvee was blocking the road, burning and twisted. Black smoke poured from its engine. They were boxed in. Behind them, the fourth vehicle was trying to maneuver, but the road was too narrow. There was nowhere to go. "We're sitting ducks," Private Moore shouted. His voice was high and cracking. His hands shook as he gripped his rifle. Hendricks kicked open his door and rolled out into the dirt. "Return fire! Suppress those positions." He brought his M4 rifle up and started shooting at the rocks above them where muzzle flashes flickered like fireflies. Sarah looked at Moore. The kid was frozen. His face was pale, his eyes too wide. He was going into shock before he even got hit. She grabbed his shoulder hard. "Moore, look at me." He turned to her, trembling. "You're going to be okay," she said firmly. "But I need you to move. Get out of this vehicle and take cover behind the engine block. Do it now." Something in her voice cut through his fear. He nodded and kicked open the rear door. Sarah followed him out, keeping low. Bullets zipped overhead so close she could feel the air move. The smell of burning metal and gunpowder filled her lungs. She hit the ground hard and crawled toward the front of the convoy. Through the smoke and chaos, she could see the lead vehicle. It was destroyed. The front end was gone, replaced by a smoking crater. But she could hear something. A sound that cut through the gunfire and the shouting, screaming. Someone was still alive in that vehicle. She keyed her radio. "This is Chen. I've got wounded in the lead vehicle. I'm moving up." "Negative," Hendricks barked back. "Stay in cover. We need to suppress the enemy first." But Sarah was already moving. She slung her medical bag over her shoulder and sprinted toward the burning Humvee. Bullets kicked up dirt at her feet. One round hit the ground so close to her head that gravel sprayed across her face. She didn't stop. She reached the vehicle and dropped to her knees beside the rear door. It was jammed. She pulled at the handle with everything she had, but it wouldn't budge. Inside, she could see two soldiers. One was slumped over the steering wheel, not moving. The other was in the back seat, writhing and clutching his leg. Blood poured between his fingers. "Hold on," Sarah shouted. "I'm getting you out." She pulled a multi-tool from her belt and wedged it into the door frame. She pried and twisted until the metal bent enough for her to get her fingers in. Then she pulled with everything she had. The door groaned and finally gave way. The soldier in the back was Corporal Jackson, a gunner she recognized from the base. He was 23 years old. He had a wife and a baby daughter back in Georgia, and his leg was shredded below the knee. The blast had torn through the floor of the Humvee and sent shrapnel into his calf. Bone was visible through the torn flesh. "I got you, Jackson," Sarah said, pulling him out of the vehicle. "I got you." She dragged him behind the wreckage and immediately went to work. Tourniquet first. She pulled it from her bag and wrapped it high on his thigh, just above the knee. She twisted the windlass tight until the bleeding slowed. Jackson screamed. The pain was unimaginable. But it was better than bleeding out. "You're doing good," she told him, her hands moving fast and sure. "Stay with me." Gunfire continued to roar around them. Hendricks and the others were laying down suppressive fire, but the enemy had the high ground. The insurgents were dug in behind the rocks and they weren't backing down. Sarah keyed her radio again. "I need cover. I've got one critical casualty and one KIA in the lead vehicle." "We're pinned down, Chen," someone shouted back. She looked up at the rocks. She could see the muzzle flashes. 3 positions, maybe 4. They were coordinated. This wasn't some random attack. This was planned. Then she heard it. A sound that made her blood run cold. The high-pitched whistle of an incoming RPG. "RPG," she screamed. The rocket streaked down from the rocks and slammed into the second Humvee. The explosion lifted the vehicle off the ground and flipped it onto its side. The blast wave knocked Sarah flat. Her ears rang. Her vision blurred. For a moment she couldn't breathe, but she forced herself up. She had to. People were dying. She crawled toward the overturned Humvee. Smoke poured from the engine. Flames licked at the tires. She could hear voices inside, muffled and desperate. "Help! We're trapped." Sarah reached the vehicle and looked through the shattered window. 3 soldiers were inside, tangled in their harnesses, hanging sideways. One of them was bleeding from the head. Another was unconscious. She tried the door. It wouldn't open. The frame was bent from the explosion. "Hendricks!" she shouted. "I need help." "They're trapped." Hendricks appeared beside her, his face covered in dust and sweat. For the first time he looked at her, really looked at her. Not with contempt, not with doubt, with something close to respect. "Can you get them out?" he asked. "Not alone," she said. "I need you to pull while I stabilize them." He nodded. No argument. No hesitation. Together they pried open the door. Sarah climbed inside the overturned vehicle, her body half upside down as she worked to free the soldiers from their harnesses. Blood dripped onto her face. The smell of fuel was overwhelming. If the vehicle caught fire, they would all burn. She cut the first harness with her trauma shears and Hendricks pulled the soldier out. Then the second. Then the third. Sarah checked each one. Head wound. Broken arm. Possible concussion. All alive. But the ambush wasn't over. As Sarah crawled out of the wreckage, she heard a sound that made her heart stop. Voices. Shouting in Pashto. Close. Too close. The insurgents were coming down from the rocks. Hendricks heard it too. He grabbed his rifle and turned to her. "Can you fight?" Sarah reached for the M9 pistol on her hip. She had qualified expert with it. But she had never fired it at another human being. She looked at the wounded soldiers lying in the dirt behind her. She looked at Jackson, barely conscious, his life held together by a tourniquet she had tied. She looked at Hendricks. "Yes," she said. And she meant it. The insurgents came down the hillside like wolves closing in on wounded prey. Sarah could see them now, dark figures moving between the rocks, their weapons raised. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more. Hendricks dropped to one knee beside the overturned Humvee and started firing controlled bursts. "Chan, get the wounded behind cover. Now." Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed Corporal Jackson under the arms and dragged him toward a shallow ditch on the side of the road. He groaned with every movement, barely conscious. She laid him down as gently as she could, then ran back for the others. Private Moore was there, his fear replaced by something harder. He helped her move the wounded soldiers one by one. They worked together, moving fast while bullets snapped through the air around them. The other soldiers from the convoy had formed a defensive line. They were outnumbered and trapped, but they were fighting back. Captain Ramirez was on the radio, calling for air support, for medevac, for anything. But they were 30 miles from the nearest base in a valley surrounded by mountains. Help wouldn't arrive in time. Sarah pulled the last wounded soldier into the ditch and did a quick assessment. 5 casualties total. 1 dead in the lead vehicle. Jackson with the destroyed leg. A soldier named Phelps with a severe head wound. 2 others with shrapnel injuries and broken bones. All of them needed a hospital. None of them were going to get one anytime soon. She had to keep them alive. That was her job. That was why she was here. But the insurgents kept coming. A burst of gunfire ripped across the ditch and Sarah pressed herself flat against the dirt. Moore was beside her, firing back with his rifle. His hands weren't shaking anymore. The kid had found his courage. "There's too many of them," he shouted. Sarah looked over the edge of the ditch. He was right. The insurgents were flanking them, moving around the convoy to attack from multiple sides. If they got behind the American position, it would be over. She keyed her radio. "Ramirez, they're trying to flank us on the east side." "I see them," Ramirez shouted back. "Hendricks, take 2 men and block that approach." Hendricks moved immediately, grabbing Moore and another soldier. But as they started to move, one of the soldiers, a specialist named Kowalski, suddenly dropped. He hit the ground hard, clutching his chest. Blood spread across his uniform, man down. Someone screamed. Sarah was already running. She crossed the open ground in seconds, bullets tearing up the earth around her. She reached Kowalski and dragged him behind the wrecked Humvee. His eyes were wide with shock and pain. She ripped open his vest and saw the wound. The bullet had entered just below his collarbone on the right side. She couldn't tell if it had hit the lung, but he was struggling to breathe. His lips were turning blue. Tension, pneumothorax. Air was building up in his chest cavity, collapsing his lung. She had seconds to act. Sarah grabbed a needle decompression kit from her bag. Her hands were steady despite the chaos, despite the gunfire, despite the screaming. She found the landmark on his chest. second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and pushed the needle through the muscle and into his chest. There was a hiss of air. Kowalski gasped and his breathing eased. The color started to return to his face. "Stay with me, Kowalski," Sarah said. She placed a chest seal over the wound and taped it down. "You're going to make it. You hear me? You're going to make it." He nodded weakly. Hendricks appeared above her, firing over the hood of the Humvee. He glanced down at Kowalski, then at Sarah. "Is he stable?" "For now," she said. "But I need to get him out of here." "We all need to get out of here," Hendricks said. He reloaded his rifle, his movements automatic and fast. "Air support is 10 minutes out. We just have to hold until then. 10 minutes. It might as well have been 10 hours. The firefight intensified. The insurgents were getting bolder, moving closer. Sarah could hear them shouting to each other, coordinating their attack. They knew the Americans were hurt and pinned down. They were moving in for the kill. Captain Ramirez's voice came over the radio, tight with urgency. "All units, conserve your ammo. Make every shot count." Sarah checked her pistol. 15 rounds in the magazine. 1 in the chamber. 16 bullets between her and the enemy. She had never imagined using them. She had joined the army to save lives, not take them. But as she looked at the wounded soldiers around her, Jackson, Kowalski, Phelps, and the others, she knew the truth. Sometimes saving lives meant fighting. Sometimes healing required violence. An insurgent appeared on top of the rocks above them, his rifle pointed down at the ditch where the wounded lay. Sarah didn't think. She raised her pistol and fired. 3 shots. Center mass. Just like she had been trained. The insurgent fell. Sarah's hands were shaking now. Not from fear. From the weight of what she had just done. She had taken a life. But she had saved 5 others. Hendricks saw it. He met her eyes across the battlefield and something passed between them. Understanding, respect, trust. "Good shot, Captain," he said. She nodded, her throat tight. The battle raged on. Minutes felt like hours. Sarah moved between the wounded, checking tourniquets, administering morphine, keeping pressure on wounds. Between each task, she fired her pistol at targets that got too close. She was a medic and a soldier now, both at the same time. Then she heard it. A sound from the sky, growing louder. The deep, thunderous roar of Apache helicopters. "Air support inbound," Ramirez shouted. "Get down! Danger close!" The 2 attack helicopters came screaming over the ridgeline like avenging angels. Their chain guns opened up, tearing into the insurgent positions with devastating precision. Rockets streaked from their pylons and exploded against the rocks. The hillside erupted in fire and smoke. The insurgents broke and ran. Those who could still move scattered into the valleys and caves. The ambush was over. Sarah collapsed against the side of the ditch, her chest heaving. Her uniform was soaked with blood, some hers from small cuts and scrapes, most of it from the soldiers she had treated. Her hands were filthy. Her face was streaked with dust and sweat, but everyone she could save was still alive. Hendricks walked over to her, his rifle slung across his chest. He was bleeding from a cut above his eye, but he didn't seem to notice. He looked down at her with an expression she had never seen from him before. Respect. He extended his hand. "You saved my men, Captain." Sarah took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. "I was just doing my job." "No," Hendricks said, his voice firm. "You did a hell of a lot more than that." The medevac helicopters arrived 15 minutes later. Sarah helped load every wounded soldier onto the Black Hawks, making sure each one was stable for the flight. Jackson squeezed her hand before they lifted him inside. "You saved my life," he said, tears in his eyes. "I'm going to see my daughter again because of you." Sarah couldn't speak. She just nodded. As the helicopters lifted off and disappeared into the sky, Sarah stood in the dirt and the smoke and the silence that followed battle. She was exhausted. She was shaking. But she was still standing. Captain Ramirez approached her. "Chen, that was the bravest thing I've ever seen. You ran into fire without hesitation. You saved 5 lives today. Maybe more." She looked at him. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Granted. I'm not just a nurse," she said quietly. "I never was," Ramirez smiled. "No, Captain. You're not. You're a soldier. And a damn good one." Word spread fast. By the time the convoy limped back to base that evening, everyone knew what had happened. They knew about the nurse who ran through gunfire to save the wounded. The nurse who fought back when the enemy closed in. the nurse who kept soldiers alive against impossible odds. They didn't call her just a nurse anymore. But Sarah's story wasn't over yet. The convoy rolled through the gates of forward operating base Rattlesnake just after nightfall. The vehicles were shot up and battered, painted with dust and smoke and blood, but everyone who could be saved had made it back alive. Sarah climbed out of the Humvee and her legs almost gave out beneath her. The adrenaline that had kept her moving for the past 8 hours was gone. In its place was exhaustion so deep it felt like gravity had doubled. Every muscle ached. Her hands were still stained with dried blood. A medic approached her with a concerned look. "Captain Chen, you need to get checked out." "You're bleeding." Sarah looked down and realized there was a gash on her forearm she hadn't even noticed. "It's nothing," she said. "Check on the others first." "Ma'am, the others are already at the aid station." "You're the last one, please." She nodded and let him lead her inside. But her mind was still in that valley, still hearing the gunfire, still feeling Kowalski's chest beneath her hands as she fought to keep him breathing, still seeing the insurgent fall when she pulled the trigger. She had killed someone today. That reality sat heavy in her chest. The medic cleaned and bandaged her arm, but Sarah barely felt it. She was somewhere else, somewhere between the person she had been that morning and the person she was now. "Captain?" She looked up. It was Private Moore. His face was clean now, the dust and gun smoke washed away. But his eyes were different. Older somehow. Combat did that. It aged you in ways that had nothing to do with time. "How are you holding up, Moore?" she asked. He sat down beside her. "I keep thinking about what you said. In the Humvee, before everything happened. You said being scared keeps you sharp." He paused. "I was terrified out there. But I saw you running into fire to pull out Jackson. And I thought, if she can do that, I can do my job. You gave me courage, ma'am." Sarah's throat tightened. "You found that courage yourself. I just reminded you it was there." Moore smiled. "The guys are talking about you. About what you did. Hendricks told everyone you saved his life. He said he was wrong about you." That surprised her. "Hendricks said that?" "Yes, ma'am, out loud. In front of everyone." After Moore left, Sarah walked across the base to the medical tent to check on the wounded. Jackson was in surgery, but the doctors said he would keep his leg. Kowalski was stable, his lung reinflated and functioning. Phelps had a skull fracture but was conscious and talking. The others would recover. 5 men would go home to their families because of what she had done. That night, Sarah lay in her bunk and tried to sleep, but the images kept coming. The explosion, the blood, the fear in Jackson's eyes, the weight of her pistol in her hand. She had been trained for this. She had prepared for this. But nothing truly prepared you for the reality of combat. She thought about her father, the Marine who had told her that respect was earned in the worst moments. She wondered what he would think of her now. She hoped he would be proud. She whispered into the darkness, "I earned it, Dad." The next morning, Captain Ramirez summoned her to the operations center. When she arrived, she found him standing with several other officers, including the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Douglas. Douglas was a tall, lean man with gray at his temples and 3 deployments worth of experience etched into the lines of his face. He looked at Sarah with an expression that was hard to read. "Captain Chen," he said, "I've been reviewing the after-action reports from yesterday's engagement. I've also spoken to every soldier in that convoy." Sarah stood at attention. "Yes, sir. You ran into enemy fire. Multiple times. You performed life-saving medical procedures under direct contact. You engaged enemy combatants, and you kept 5 critically wounded soldiers alive until medevac arrived." He paused. "That's not the behavior of someone who was just a nurse, as I understand some soldiers described you." Sarah said nothing. What could she say? Douglas continued. "I'm recommending you for the Bronze Star with Valor device. Your actions went far beyond the call of duty. You are a credit to the uniform and to the medical corps." The words hit her harder than she expected. The Bronze Star for Valor. That was a medal her father had earned in Desert Storm. She had seen it in its frame on his desk her entire childhood. "Thank you, sir," she managed to say. "But I was just doing my job. Any medic would have done the same." "No," Douglas said firmly. "Not any medic. Not anyone at all. What you did required exceptional courage. Don't diminish it." Ramirez smiled at her. "You've earned the respect of every soldier on this base, Captain, including the ones who doubted you." As if on cue, there was a knock on the door. Sergeant First Class Hendricks entered, his cover in his hand. He looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to be anywhere else. But he had come anyway. "Sir, permission to speak to Captain Chen?" he asked. Douglas nodded. "Granted. We'll give you the room." The officers filed out, leaving Sarah alone with Hendricks, the same man who had mocked her, who had questioned her qualifications, who had said she would freeze when things got bad. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at her. Then he spoke. "I owe you an apology, Captain." His voice was rough but sincere. "I judged you before you ever had a chance to prove yourself. I thought you were just another officer who hadn't been tested. I was wrong. Dead wrong." Sarah waited. Hendricks continued. "You ran into that kill zone without hesitation. You saved Jackson. You saved Kowalski. You fought alongside us when the enemy closed in. You did everything right. And more than that, you kept me from making a mistake that would have gotten people killed. When I wanted to leave the wounded and establish a perimeter, you went after them anyway. You were right. I was wrong." He extended his hand. "You're a soldier, Captain. A damn good one. And I'm honored to serve with you." Sarah took his hand and shook it. This was the respect her father had talked about. Not given freely, but earned. Forged in fire and blood and impossible choices. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said. "That means a lot." Hendricks nodded. Then he did something unexpected. He came to attention and saluted her. Not because regulations required it, but because he wanted to, a gesture of respect between warriors. Sarah returned the salute, her heart full. Over the following weeks, Sarah continued her work at the base. But everything was different now. When she walked through the motor pool, soldiers nodded to her with respect. When she entered the mess hall, men made room for her and asked her to sit with them. When she passed groups of soldiers, they didn't see a nurse. They saw a medic who had proven herself in combat. They saw a leader. They saw a hero, but Sarah didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had done what needed to be done, what any good soldier would do, what she had been trained to do. 3 months later, the ceremony took place on a clear morning at Bagram Airfield. Sarah stood in her dress uniform in front of the entire battalion. Her hands were steady. Her back was straight. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Lieutenant Colonel Douglas read the citation aloud. It detailed her actions during the ambush, how she had exposed herself to enemy fire to save wounded soldiers, how she had performed life-saving medical procedures under direct enemy contact, how she had engaged hostile combatants when the perimeter was threatened, how her courage and skill had saved 5 American lives. He pinned the bronze star on her chest. The medal felt heavy, meaningful, like it carried the weight of every life she had touched, every soldier she had saved. The battalion applauded. Among the crowd, she saw Hendricks standing with the other NCOs. He was clapping harder than anyone. Beside him was Corporal Jackson, back from Germany where he had recovered from his injuries. He was on crutches, but he was alive. He was smiling, and when their eyes met, he mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Sarah had to fight back tears. After the ceremony, soldiers came up to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her their own stories. A young female private approached her with wide, nervous eyes. "Ma'am," the private said, "I'm going to be a combat medic. I ship to training next month, and I just wanted you to know, you're the reason I chose this path. You showed me that women can do anything in this army, that we can be just as brave, just as strong. Thank you for that." Sarah put her hand on the young woman's shoulder. "You don't need to thank me. Just be the best medic you can be. And remember, it's not about proving anything to anyone else. It's about being there when your soldiers need you most." The private nodded, her eyes bright. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her quarters and looked at the medal in her hands, the bronze star with its V device for valor. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the doubts, the mockery, the whispers, and then the moment when everything changed, the moment when she stopped being just a nurse and became something more, a soldier, a medic, a warrior. She pulled out her phone and opened the photos. There was one of her father in his Marine Corps uniform, young and proud. She had carried it with her through every deployment. She whispered to the image, "I did it, Dad. I earned their respect, just like you said I would." Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter lifted off into the Afghan sky. Another mission, another convoy, another group of soldiers heading into danger, and Sarah Chen knew that if they needed her, she would be ready. Not because she had something to prove. Not because she wanted recognition or medals. But because that was who she was, not just a nurse, not just a woman, not just an officer. A United States Army combat medic, a soldier who ran toward the sound of guns when others ran away. A healer who understood that sometimes saving lives required courage that went beyond medicine. She pinned the medal to the board above her bunk, next to the photo of her father. Then she lay down, closed her eyes, and for the first time since the ambush, she slept peacefully. She had earned her place. She had proven herself. And she knew in her heart that when the next call came, when the next soldier needed her, she would answer without hesitation, because that was what soldiers did. And Captain Sarah Chen was every bit a soldier.